There you go. Okay, well, I think we have achieved our critical mass. Thank you, everybody, for attending the Medical Device Playbook on Optics today, May 27th. We're really excited to offer this specialized content. Sometimes our content's a little broader about medical device entrepreneurship generally. Today, it's more focused on optics and the use of optics. And we have assembled 3 PhD, very experienced people to talk about their experiences in implementing optics in medical devices. Just as we get going here, let me give you a little bit of context in case you haven't been to one of these before, what they're about. So my name is Scott Phillips. I'm the CEO and founder of StarFish Medical. Medical Device Playbook actually started as a live conference in Toronto and Vancouver that we did every year, invited speakers from around North America to speak to mostly local audiences about medical device entrepreneurship generally. And had some good success, lots of great connections. And lo and behold, COVID showed up and we've been doing it virtually ever since and running it every month as a shorter and more focused event. And we actually get about twice as many people attend typically than we would get live. So it's actually been very successful, and maybe post-COVID we'll carry it on and complement it with the live things as well. So a tiny little bit about StarFish Medical, just so you understand our credibility to offer such a thing. We're a medical device development services company based in Victoria and Toronto, Canada, serving North America, about 80%-ish of our customers in the US. And we're one of the larger companies in North America that offers this specialized service with lots of specialty people, which I won't get into. Types of clients are sort of a mix of large corporates, research institutions, lots and lots of startups, probably more startups than anything else. All of them with cutting edge technology spinning out of universities and so on. And so that's what we like to do. And the sort of things we like to do, use lasers to probe platelets or isolate DNA, or they have ingestible robotic capsules, or they have raster scanning lasers to look at blood perfusion in skin, or they measure brain waves, or all sorts of interesting technology things. So, and you can see we care a lot about how they integrate into the workflow of the environment, and they're beautiful and so on. So that's enough about StarFish. Just want to give you some sense of what this is all about. So let's get into the topic of the day. Optics, as I say, is a specialty topic and attracts some highly educated people doing some really amazing cutting edge things. And we, in fact, have an optical department, which has, we have labs in both our Victoria and Toronto facilities. And so today we'll be presenting from 3 speakers, and I'll tell you who they are as they come up. Darren Kraemer will be the first one, then Len Zheleznyak, and then Brian King. And each of them has their own focus on what you can learn and take away from their experience in the field. A couple quick notes. Next month, our content will be based on assays. So it'll be a biotech focused seminar. And so if that's of interest to you, then please sign up. And if you're signed up for this one, you'll get the notice for the next one. So you don't have to remember to do anything. Also, if you're interested in asking a question to our presenters, there will be a Q&A section afterwards. We will not be bringing people live on camera or anything. Basically, if you have a question, put in a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be moderating that session afterwards. I can't promise we'll get to every question. I may combine questions, and we'll see how it goes. We'll try to make it as balanced and as interesting and relevant as possible. So without further ado, and using up their time, let me talk to you a tiny bit about Darren Kraemer. Darren is an old friend and an amazing person all around. His career started at age 7 when he won a science fair, and that it kindled his love of science, evidently. And he ended up going to U of T to study engineering science, and eventually did his PhD in optics using tunable femtosecond lasers. And then he did a collaboration with the Max Born Institute in Berlin, and he published the first temperature-dependent correlation spectra of OH stretching vibrations, so pure liquid water. And then he also started a company called Atodyne, which actually he started before he's even finished his PhD, and I won't tell you what that's about. He'll tell us about Atodyne, but it's a pretty amazing story. And partly involved him schlepping lasers around China on trains to try to find a good outcome for that company. And subsequently, he started a company called Light Matter Interaction, which has already developed several things, had an exit, and is working on some pretty amazing technology, which I'm sure he'll tell us about. So with that, I'll pass the floor over to you, Darren. You go ahead and share your screen.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Can you guys see my screen all right?
Yes.
Excellent. So that was a very nice introduction. I'm Darren Kraemer. I'll introduce myself again, CEO of Light Matter Interaction. And I've been commercializing optical technology, or trying at least, for the last 15 years with a focus on surgical lasers. Now, when Scott invited me to give this talk, I jumped at the chance to discuss some of the more interesting ideas and some of the devices that I've encountered during my journey around the laser field. And really, this is just a chance to talk about optics. So I'll begin with my real introduction to the topic, which was in the final year of engineering physics. I took an elective in the chemistry department taught by Professor Dwayne Miller. And at some point, while explaining how atoms and molecules worked, he challenged the class to solve a problem that involved a polymer photonic crystal that he had invented for 3D optical data storage. And whoever solved this problem, he said, would get a job in his laser lab for the summer. And, well, I was interested in working with this early femtosecond 2-photon scanning confocal microscope that he had, and so I couldn't resist. But also, I really didn't want to go work for the man, which in those days was basically Nortel. So a mathematical solution to his problem appeared to me, and when I showed it to him, he got so excited that we filed a patent. Needless to say that this technology didn't live up to its commercial potential, but it got me into his lab. And I spent the next 2 years desperately trying to reproduce the computational results experimentally. And I had to do this with a bunch of junk left over from previous students' projects, which included one of these confocal microscopes, possibly one of the first ever, and also a Kerr-lens mode-locked chromium lysgaff femtosecond laser that, as far as I could tell, would never successfully pulse. I thought it pulsed once, but it was a hallucination from staring at the oscilloscope for too long. But I liked tinkering with the optics, and it seemed to me like a PhD was the easiest way that I could keep doing this. So I spent a lot of time in a dark laser lab, which is what this is a picture of, fiddling with knobs. In fact, about 5 years later, I was putting the finishing touches on a tunable mid-infrared femtosecond laser based on optical parametric chirp pulse amplification. So for those of you who don't know, that's the kind of laser that you might find in a fusion lab. Now, the other chemistry professors on my supervisory committee didn't think that laser design was worthy of a PhD in chemistry, which is what I was studying. But Professor Miller had neither the capital nor the intention of buying any of this stuff commercially. So he convinced us that this was something we could build, and we did. And we kept building it, and eventually I was able to perform the spectroscopy experiments. But this was the most powerful laser of its kind for about 3 months until Raytheon made it like 10 times better. But I built it on 2 8-foot by 4-foot optical tables. And this included a passively mode-locked picosecond laser that was synchronized to a magic mode-locked femtosecond fiber laser, 100 megawatt peak power regenerative amplifier, stretchers, compressors, interferometric autocorrelators, real-time ones so that we could measure the pulse duration as we were tweaking with the mirrors. And I built them out of some old stereo equipment where you just glue mirrors to the speakers. We even built a single shot frog, which is a frequency resolved optical gating for those of you who are interested in dispersion measurements. And then ultimately this insane 4-wave mixing spectrometer for transient grading and photon echo experiments that we wanted to do on thin films of water trapped inside very, very thin silicon nitride cells. So obviously you guys can see the commercial applications. Cue the laugh track. And so today I'm supposed to be talking about optics in medicine, but Scott said I can talk as much about optics as I like, so I'm going to take him up on that. But there's a clue as to what the great commercial application was that we dreamed up in that lab almost 2 decades ago. But before I can get there, with a bunch of group members, while I was still doing my PhD, we started a company to commercialize this great idea, and we called it Attendee. But it became apparent very quickly that we couldn't convince anyone, especially investor types of people, that there was a business behind that 16-foot table full of knobs. It was hardware. Worse, it was laser hardware. And worse, it was laser hardware that would eventually involve clinical trials. So we needed some money to keep going and to build a viable prototype because we wanted to validate this great idea. And I had no intention of looking for a job. The dot-com bubble had burst and Nortel wasn't even around at the time. So since I didn't want to stop making lasers, we needed to find some customers as soon as possible. And we found some all over the world in the advanced manufacturing industry. Because in those days, there was only one viable industrial picosecond laser on the market. And it was a gigantic water-cooled thing made by Lumera Laser that weighed almost 300 pounds. And with very little real industry experience, not knowing any better, we designed and built one. Not necessarily in that order, but it was entirely air-cooled and it was a fraction of the size. You can see one here, including the switchable second and third harmonic output module that was very popular at the time. So the market was still relatively small for this kind of device when we started in 2010, but it grew quickly, driven a lot by display and cell phone technology. And still, it wasn't easy to find new customers because you had to convince people who'd never heard of ultrafast laser processing that it was the solution to their problem. So we built an application development lab where we could test samples for customers and show them all the cool things that we could do with these really short pulses. And we got to play in this lab with every imaginable material, from millimeter-sized batteries to drug-eluting stents. And we amassed a collection of galvos and stages, and sometimes we connected them all together, you know, with galvos pointing at galvos and obscene degrees of freedom. And this was also that we could achieve some of these impossible tasks that our customers wanted, like drilling vias that get wider as they go deeper. So we learned a lot from our interaction with industry, from going to clean rooms, and we would proudly show off how rugged our lasers were. Hoping you can see this video where we demonstrate how much more rugged they are than the competition, with a kind of bravado that was maybe a byproduct of our general lack of conventional experience. So we spent a lot of time building these elaborate lasers and then trying to destroy them before the customers did. Eventually, we sold out to a much larger laser company, and this was necessitated by a sudden vertical integration that was going on in the laser business at the time. And we felt like we would be left behind. So what did we do with our newfound wealth? Well, we used it all to continue developing our brilliant medical laser idea. So we said goodbye to the industrial market. In other words, we said goodbye to our revenue stream, and we changed the name of our company to Light Matter Interaction. So in this process, you know, I realized that lasers are just a fancy light bulb, and without matter to interact with, they wouldn't be nearly as much fun, hence the name of the company. And I want to explain a little bit, since I have this opportunity, what I find so fascinating about this field. So most of us have some intuitive understanding of the basic optical phenomena. Most toddlers can recognize transmission and reflection. Grade school, they start noticing refraction and absorption, at least with crayons, eventually scattering and diffraction. But as you go deeper in this subject, not only do we learn more about matter itself, but also all the different ways that we can use light to manipulate matter. Absorption and emission give us incredible insights into the material structure. And the different wavelengths or frequency bands, they interact with different modes in the atomic and molecular system, from radio waves that hardly interact at all to microwaves, which spin our molecules. The infrared region is my favorite, where all the vibrational modes show themselves. And then you've got visible and ultraviolet, and eventually you have enough photon energy, finally, that you can excite electrons. And once you get to X-rays and gamma rays, now you have ionizing radiation that can rip these electrons completely out of the atoms themselves. And here the physics begins to look an awful lot like chemistry. But time and intensity is also a critical factor. So imagine now that you've harnessed unlimited energy and you plan to destroy the world, hypothetically. The rate at which you deposit that energy into the earth is going to greatly affect the outcome. If you slowly let it trickle, nothing's going to happen. But if you condense it enough, who knows? I calculated that you need about 3 × 10⁻32 joules to reduce the Earth to dust and move the pieces to infinity. So pulse duration is important. And thus, we can't think about power as just simply energy over time. So if you pulse a laser, you have to consider that there's the average power, which is the energy times the repetition rate. And then there's also the peak power, which is the energy divided by the pulse duration. And so by pulsing the lasers and making the pulses shorter and shorter, you can concentrate your field strength and you can achieve much higher peak powers. And this gives us the ability to fiddle with matter in all sorts of new ways. But what's really going on? Well, these electromagnetic fields, like beams or pulses of light, they deform the probability density of the charged particles in the matter. And so you can see this kind of as a stretching effect. The effect of the field and the local changes caused by the effect of the field on the neighboring molecules doesn't just appear and disappear instantaneously like the field itself. And this means that materials have an optical response that's not unlike the impulse response we learned about in signal processing. And at the heart of this impulse response is the anharmonic potential that's holding these molecules together. And when driven beyond this weak harmonic center, nonlinear behavior starts to happen all the way up to the dissociation limit, at which point your matter starts changing into something else very quickly. So without going into the derivation of higher order Kraemer-Kronig's relations from Maxwell's laws, which I recommend to anyone that has trouble sleeping, let's just say you can do some pretty neat things with intensity-dependent optical effects, such as this comparison of 1 and 2 photon fluorescence. You can see on the right, the 2 photon laser only excites the fluorescence where the beam is very intense and more than 1 photon can absorb. So the photons interact non-linearly with the material. And there are many insanely cool optics phenomena that can be exploited to learn about materials and to manipulate them. 2 photon microscopy, pump probe spectroscopy, Raman, optical coherence tomography, coherent control, which for those of you who don't know is about the manipulation of chemical reactions by carefully controlling the packets of laser pulses. Some materials can be modified or programmed with light. But now imagine that we're able to drive statistically impossible chemical reactions with our lasers. And all this simply wouldn't be possible with just sunlight and regular light bulbs. So you need coherent laser light. When Theodore Maiman first invented the laser in the 1960s, he called it a solution looking for a problem. And shortly thereafter, someone found a problem. Oh, how did that get in here? But if you look at the history of medicine, amazingly important clinical applications for lasers were developed shortly after and alongside with the lasers themselves. Maiman invented the ruby laser, and the doctor found a use for it, removing birth defects. Later, CO2 lasers and excimer lasers, they found their niche in medicine. And the hospital is one of the roughest environments where optical systems can live. And so, you know, countless innovations have cross-pollinated back and forth into the laser labs. It's hard to trace some of these ideas. So instead of that, I'll just go on and tell you how I got involved in all of this. I blame the vibrational line shape of water. So vibrational line shapes can tell us a lot about what's going on, but sometimes there are long-standing problems. In this absorption spectrum of liquid water from 1895, you can see that the water peak around the OH stretching band is a very funny shape, and this is a classic problem. Now, it's not as simple as a homogeneous H2O molecule floating around. They have all these varying degrees of hydrogen bonding. And this broadens the spectrum. And since it's a liquid, there's this great degree of variety and these dynamics in the local environment. Temperature holds an important clue because we can use it to form and break the hydrogen bonds. But it's really difficult to interpret these line shapes unless you have a little bit more information. And we're able to get this information from some of these time-resolved vibrational spectroscopy methods that I unfortunately don't have time to go into now, such as photon echo experiments. But you can measure interesting things, for example, a correlation spectrum, which lets you watch how, using the laser as a strobe light, how energy that's absorbed can be redistributed from mode to mode. And we can also follow spectral diffusion, which is essentially a measurement of the memory that the liquid has of its local environment. And it turns out that water is some very interesting stuff. All you need is the right laser and some ridiculously complicated optical setups, like my old heterodyne detected diffractive optics-based photon echo spectrometer. And with a little signal processing, voila, you have a PhD in chemistry. And while measuring this stuff isn't so easy, explaining it is even harder. And so to make sense of this picture, I made a flow chart. The commercial potential is obvious, right? Cue the laugh track. So now at some point while all this was going on, my professor wrote a very interesting number on the blackboard in his office. And since he'd introduced me to crazy numbers like femtosecond and attosecond or petawatt peak power, this seemed an entirely plausible number. And although I wasn't really familiar with the units at the time, he said this was the market for a solution to the thermal problems associated with lasers in medicine. And here's a laser video showing the effect of a thermal laser on skin. And notice that the skin shrinks, it burns because of the heat, and this limits the precision and it slows the healing, causes scars and adhesions. And these are major problems in surgery. So what's going on? Oh, that didn't show right. There we go. Thermal lasers have long pulses, continuous beams, and the light's absorbed, and it raises the temperature of the material beyond the melting or the burning point. Meanwhile, the heat diffuses into the surrounding tissue, causing significant damage. And if you do all this fast enough, you can also make some pretty violent shock waves. This is very useful in a number of applications. And so you see the adoption of lasers like carbon dioxide lasers, erbium YAG, holmium YAG, for specific niche applications. Eye surgery being an early adopter of many of these technologies. But intensity is critically important. So an obvious solution to some of these thermal processes, or to reduce the heat affected zone, as a machinist might call it, is to go to shorter and shorter pulses. Now, in this case, the mechanism of action is plasma mediated vaporization, in which the light field strength of these, condensed pulses is so high that it tears the electrons out of the atoms and vaporizes everything down to smaller particles. And this is extremely useful in certain applications, like you remember the stuff that we were doing for industry. But it's also found adoption in medicine, particularly in ophthalmology, in refractive eye surgery, and in cataract eye surgery. But I think you'll hear more about that later. These high energy electrons, they don't go far, and they irradiate the nearby cells. And you can see from the histology results that there's an almost complete row of damaged cells. And because of these intact irradiated cells, the signals, the proteins that begin the healing process seem to be delayed. So nonetheless, you make beautiful pulses. The effects of the high energy electrons, it has been proposed, some people could take advantage of this as an improved version of cancer radiotherapy, in which the mutagenic properties of the femtosecond laser have an advantage over gamma ray treatment, in that you, just like the two photon fluorescence experiment, you can avoid doses on the entry if you're able to project inside of the material. Here, you would form your plasma, and the electrons would be further accelerated by the remaining electron field by a reverse Bremsstrahlung effect, and essentially nuke everything around it. So nonetheless, people persist in voluntarily shining femtosecond lasers into their eyes. And in eye surgery especially, it makes sense to take advantage of nonlinear optics to perform surgical procedures without any contact whatsoever. Oops, should have put that one up first. So if you put this in perspective with the other microsurgery disruption mechanisms that are available, you have little scalpels which cause damage by tearing through tissue, and ultrasonic needles that cause shock waves and cavitation damage far from the tip. But what about another mechanism that avoids this effect? Well, femtosecond lasers, you can go below the surface and you can make material changes. But we came up with something different. You see, if you ask most laser physicists about laser machining, they'll show you a picture like this, in which it's either thermal ablation or it's photodisruption. But we know that by shifting the wavelength of the pulses, to the mid-infrared, we could take advantage of the fast energy distribution of the water molecules inside the tissue, but also while operating below the ionization threshold due to the lower photon energy, which shifts the threshold upwards. In other words, we identified a unique space for ourselves. I'll go on. Basically, what that means is we can make a pulse that's shorter than a nanosecond, absorbs within a micron of the surface of tissue that contains water, and vaporizes the tissue faster than heat or shock wave can escape. It also doesn't cause any ionization. And when we zoom in on, in this case, it's a pig jaw, we see remarkably few damaged cells, and we also see intact collagen waving around. Is it even possible to cut a cell in half? Maybe. What we observed when we took this into a healing study was that our cuts healed even faster than a scalpel. And when we looked at the protein signals of scar formation, they weren't there. So the only problem is that we didn't really have commercially available sources of our 8-foot by 4-foot type laser. Unless you could afford a free electron laser, again, obvious commercial applications. So we've spent the last decade in improving our laser technology significantly, and only out of necessity because no one else appreciated the applications for it. So we've gone from 80 milliwatts to several watts, and now we're working on reducing the size and improving the efficiency in all fiber-based amplified lasers. I wish I had more time to talk about clinical applications. I can show you a few videos. I suggest that here you can see just a little montage of laser processing of various tissues. I think one of the best demonstrations is this vocal cord, where you see a conventional cut made by a CO2 laser that you'd find in a surgeon's office. And by comparison, you see our laser cutting with almost no thermal damage whatsoever above it. And we have many examples of this. We can cut on contact with fiber optics. We can turn tissue into dust for easy aspiration in a very controlled way. We'll just have to wait till the aspiration happens. Now, to give you an idea of the scale, that blue fiber optic is about 0.2 microns in size. And of course, we can make that significantly smaller. We can project from the surface and make almost imperceptible cuts. And most importantly, we think that we can make incisions that aren't going to cause scars. So the most important feature I've learned that you need for the adoption of a new technology, especially a laser technology in medicine, is that it needs to be reliable, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to have a significant measurable advantage. It has to be faster, it has to be safer, it has to be smaller, it has to be easier. One of those things or you don't stand a chance. One of the interesting applications I'd like to tell you about quickly is a new spin-off company we've created, which is a joint venture between the University Health Network in Toronto and Unity St. Mike's Hospital, where we're working on fast and accurate tissue characterization based on the work of some brilliant scientists and doctors who've shown that they can use our laser as an ideal vaporization source for molecular analysis through mass spectrometry, in which they can not only identify tissue type, but they can also identify and grade tumors in real time. And we see many applications for this from the pathology lab to the operating room and also to the office setting. So I think I've taken up enough of your time. If you have more questions or you'd like to learn more, then feel free to contact me here.
Great. Thanks so much, Darren. It's always super exciting and fun to watch you speak. I wish we could have given you an hour and a half to tell that story, but it would have been fascinating.
I would have taken it all.
Yes, you would. And it would have been fascinating the whole time. I hope the rest of our audience is as fascinated by Darren's style and substance as I am. So let's move right along to Len Zheleznyak. And Len is a wonderful guy. He's the Vice President of Vision Science at Clerio Vision, which is a startup, very ambitious startup company in Rochester. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a sec. Prior to his doctoral work, he worked on photonic devices for inspection of pharmaceuticals, which was a startup which was ultimately sold. He then completed his PhD in optics from the University of Rochester in 2014. He's had research interests in presbyopia, intraocular lens design, adaptive optic systems for study of the visual system. So he's really an ophthalmic specialist. And he's currently developing non-invasive methods of correcting refractive error in the human eye using ultrafast laser phenomena to modify refractive index. And I don't know if you followed that, but that's outrageous. Nobody's ever tried anything like that before. And I'm sure, I don't want to steal any of Len's thunder. I'm sure he'll tell us about that. Of course, he's, as a successful academic, has published numerous articles, book chapters, etc. So let me pass the floor to Len and he'll tell us the story.
Hey. Thanks for the nice intro. Darren, fun talk and really good segue into this one. So a couple differences. I have not been with Clerio through a successful outcome, at the end of a company. We're very much on the journey and still on the journey. So in preparing for this talk, I thought, well, what can I share? I'll share some things, what I've brought with me on this journey that have really helped me survive and thrive on this journey. We use lasers. I'll tell you what we do. So I'll give you a little spiel on the story of Clerio, our startup company. I'll tell you what it is that we do, and then I'm going to tell you about these things that I've found essential, things to bring with me on this journey, things to pack. So, story of Clerio. I'm going to simplify this. There was a university. There were professors. There were papers. There were PhDs. There were conferences. They had an idea. This idea was funded, through research grants and by Bausch & Lomb, but then a company, Valiant, acquired Bausch & Lomb. Valiant, they don't do R&D. They cut all the funding to R&D, and this nice juicy fruit, this apple that had been growing on the tree that had accumulated all these PhDs and patents and papers, it was cut off from the tree, and it was left orphaned. And that's when Clerio began. So we got to scoop up all this intellectual property and all these ideas on this really exciting technology. We started this startup company called Clerio Vision. That's when I came on board in 2014, and it's been a rocket ship ever since. So this journey for me, I was the first employee. We have about 100 people now. We've gone through many rounds of fundraising, and it is such a challenge to go from being a PhD student where you're trained to be an independent contributor, to be really good at a thing and contribute to that thing, to no longer being the only person working on that project. If the rocket is too big, too much rocket for one pilot, you need many pilots. So I'm going to tell you guys about that journey and that transition for me. So this is kind of the story of Clerio. So started in about 2014, 15. So what is the idea? What is the thing that we do? Darren, great talk. As you talked about, there's a couple ways to bend or focus light. The two ways that I'm going to highlight here is you can either change the shape of a lens, or you can change the internal refractive index. Now, changing the shape of a lens, that's how everybody does it. That's how you create lenses of different focal lengths. Your spectacles, your contact lenses. In LASIK surgery, an ophthalmologist will use a excimer laser to ablate tissue to resculpt the shape of the cornea. But we don't want to do that. Our laser, we're not cutting. We don't remove any tissue. We change the chemistry. We change the ingredients to alter the refractive index. This is a less invasive approach to vision correction, and that's really our mission, is to have a less invasive approach, a better way to correct the refractive errors of the human sight. So we use this refractive indexing idea. We came up with an acronym, as you must. LYRIC stands for Laser Induced Refractive Index Change. And as I said, in LASIK and traditional refractive surgery, instead of sculpting the shape of the cornea, we alter the internal refractive index of the cornea. And we do that by staying below a damage threshold. So we have pulse energies hundreds to thousands of times lower than the pulse energies used in lasers designed to cut tissue. We don't want to cut, we don't want to remove anything. We're just changing the chemistry. So for example, the human cornea, it has a refractive index about 1.4. Any dielectric material, cornea included, it's really a cocktail of ingredients. Cornea, it's mostly water and some collagen. And then it's mixed in some ratio, like 4 parts water, 1 part collagen. Water has a refractive index of 133. Collagen has an index of 1.5. You mix these, you have some average. But if you can change the ratio of those ingredients, make it a little less wet, or make it a little more wet, you'll change the refractive index. And that's the idea behind our technology. So we have a femtosecond laser, we focus it into a material, scan it, we scan that focal spot in a contact lens or cornea, and as you increase the pulse energy or the laser power, you'll affect this refractive index change. Eventually, you'll reach a threshold here where you're going to break the material, and you'll cut it, you'll ablate it, as to what Darren was speaking about earlier. So our goal is to stay below that cutting threshold. And below that cutting threshold, there's a functional relationship. More energy, more refractive index change. We've written many lenses. They have very nice optical quality. This is a picture of a resolution target. And this element here in the yellow box, that corresponds to 2020 letter E, or a spatial frequency of 30 cycles per degree. So we have very nice image quality there. So what applications do we have of Lyric? There's the cornea application. This is the system that we built in Victoria at StarFish, and we ended up shipping it to a clinical site where we did our first in human study in cornea. There on the left, if you look hard enough, you can see a Fresnel lens, some rings here in the cornea. And this is a cross-sectional OCT view of a cornea. And this thin layer here is the refractive index modified layer. So we're changing the refractive index only in this layer. In this case, it was a 2-photon process. And like Darren showed with the fluorescence, single photon fluorescence, and 2-photon fluorescence, we only have this multi-photon effect in a thin layer. It's about 10 or 20 microns thick in the cornea. We also do this treatment in intraocular lenses. Cataract surgery, it's the most ubiquitous, most common form of surgery in the world, but about half the time when this prosthetic lens is implanted into your eye to replace the natural crystalline lens, it's of the wrong focal length. Because the lens, it moves around in the eye during the wound healing process. So what we propose to do is adjust the already implanted intraocular lens to do a touch-up, an optical touch-up, and correct that residual refractive error. The third main application of Lyric at Clerio is in contact lenses. Here's a Lyric pattern in a contact lens. So the nice thing about Lyric is we change the optics not by changing the thickness of the lens. So any dioptric power contact lens, they all have the same thickness. I was at the National Science Foundation giving a talk about Lyric, and this MIT professor came up to me all very excited afterwards. He told me he's aphakic. That means he doesn't have a lens in his eye, which makes him a 20 diopter hyperope. And he can wear contact lenses because they're too thick. He has these, big spectacles. So we can make contact lenses that are very thin, which allow the cornea to breathe, regardless of what their optical correction is, regardless of what the diopters of power are. Now at Clerio, we have this technology that it's cool. Yes, it's very cool, but the needs are huge in these 3 different segments. So at my first startup, Ometric, it's a different story. It was a spectroscopy startup. That was the case of, like, you have a technology that's really cool, but you don't know what to do with it, and you try finding applications and marketing it. That's a slog. That's a very hard thing to do. With Clerio, we just have to develop these things so they work well enough, develop them until they can be deployed clinically, and it's going to go like crazy with these 3 things. I'm not a business guy. I don't have an MBA. I like to say I count photons. I don't count dollars. So I can't give you the whole business spiel behind these things. But when we go to conferences, talk to ophthalmologists, they're extremely excited. Ophthalmologists, they're early adopters of technology. They use high-tech stuff, and they've been using the same technology for about 30 years with LASIK, with laser refractive surgery. So they're chomping at the bit for something new and something better and something safer. So that's what we're offering them. Now at Clerio, so we can't turn down any of these 3 applications, and it makes it crazy for us because we have to do 3 things at once. It's like having 3 companies in one, and that makes it very hard. I used to joke, I need a Clerio neck brace because you get whiplash from working on cornea project to having to switch 180 degrees to doing some other project. One huge, big challenge for us as we've grown is maintaining communication, good communication between all of our teams trying to do these 3 different projects. Also tell you a little more about Clerio that, you know, on the spectrum of how you can exit a startup company, at one end of a startup, you do a thing, you sell it to a big corporation, and you go like this, you never do it again. They give you a check, you go home, you never see the technology again, they do it forever or whatever. On the other side of the spectrum, you have like Zeiss or Ford, where you're going to make a company and you're going to keep it and you're going to give it to your great-grandchildren. That's the other end of the spectrum. So at Clerio, with these 3 projects, we're at this side of the spectrum on one project where we're partnered with a corporation. We develop it to a certain stage. They give us a check. We go like this. We never do it again. Also, at the same time, for contact lens, we're developing that ourselves. And then thirdly, with a third project, we're co-developing it with a corporation to bring that to market. So we're trying to do a few different things at the same time. I don't know if I'd recommend that. It's very hard to do that, but these things, I think they're probably from a business case, they're too good to turn down. The need is too great in the market. So enough about what the tech is. Let me tell you about these essential tools, the things I've found to be really valuable. So 3 things, but before I tell you about what to bring on this journey, you have to kind of know like where you're going. So what are the goals? So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what do you want your organization to look like? 2 things that have come up that come to mind. One is whatever technological challenges you have today, 5 years from now, you will have innovated your way out of that. That's the goal, right? Like 5 years from now, I don't want to have to be banging my head against the wall trying to solve the same problems as today. So innovation is one thing that we have to always be very good at and always be getting better at, to innovate, to invent. The second thing is team is going to grow. You have to scale in size. So what do I pack in my bag to make sure I'm going to be successful at innovation and at scaling in size? So here's 3 things. One thing, becoming the expert and humility. I am a vision scientist. This was my training, vision, ophthalmology and vision. I didn't know anything about laser physics. So I started reading papers. This was so huge. Like, you have to become the expert. There's no way to BS your way out of it. You have to become the expert at the thing that you're trying to do. Google Scholar, great resource. Reading papers. University libraries where they have all the physics textbooks to learn about what is pulse compression, what is group delay dispersion, how do you make a short pulse, going through, you know, many lenses and water and materials that are going to stretch your laser pulse out. So that was my journey on, you really have to become the expert. Something I learned from our then CEO, Mike Totterman, this quote, "Ooh, tell me more." We would have, I had the luxury of being the technical guy at all our venture capital investor meetings, whenever we were courting large corporations, the big ophthalmic corporations, to sign a deal with us for a partnership. I had the luxury of being the technical guy to explain what is it that we do, what is the thing. I love that process. And I learned from Mike, he would do this very cool thing. He'd say, they would ask us a hard question, maybe something we don't know the answer to. It's a startup. This is a baby technology. We're the only ones in the world that do this thing. So there's a lot that we know. There's a lot that we don't know also. He'd say, "Oh, tell me more." And you would be surprised how much you learn by asking this question. Just ask people to expound on their questions, and we learned a lot, and that was really helpful for us, because making a startup based on PhD dissertations, you get dogma from university. You inherit this dogma, and that Bible of truth it's not always truth. So you have to, we learned that, for example, we have a multiphoton process, right? Well, the dogma says that the higher the numerical aperture, the more multiphoton process you have. So you must need very high numerical aperture optics. Those are really expensive. What happens if you do it at low numerical aperture? Well, turns out you have a longer depth of focus, you have a thicker lyric layer, and for accumulating optical phase change, that works out just fine, because optical phase is the product of refractive index and the thickness of your layer. So you can break dogma, learning, it's all good. Ooh, tell me more, that was a great one. Another thing I really had a lot of fun with is watching YouTube videos of Richard Feynman. Watching him speak in his lectures, that's also a great resource. There are experts out there that we can learn from, and we shouldn't be shy. So you kind of need humility on that journey. Like, yes, you have to become the expert, but there's always smarter people out there that know a lot more than you do. And I always try and learn as much as I can from them, ideally. So becoming the expert in humility, super important. That's how we overcome technical challenges. Second thing, scaling. So you go from, I went from being the first employee to now we have 100 people. And I hope we're going to keep going, but we've grown a lot. And when you're a PhD student, when I didn't know how to be a manager. You know, like when you collect the data yourself, you know the data inside and out. But now the plane is too big for one pilot. You need a team. The project is getting so big, it's too much for one person. That's good. That's the way it's supposed to be because you're growing, right? But for me, it was definitely a struggle to learn how to manage people, to learn how to not know the data so intimately, trust people, take their word for it, not be a micromanager. And that scaling thing, going from being an independent contributor to a manager should not be overlooked because I was blindsided by it. There's this unspoken expectation for an engineer or a scientist that as you climb some corporate ladder or whatever, it makes sense to go from master contributor to manager of others. But those are like totally different skill sets. So what's the thing that you actually pack in your bag? I think just awareness of it. Awareness, this is going to happen. And that all these roles, independent contributor, manager, they have an arc. They have a start, they have an end. And every time we start a new project, I begin as the innovator on that project, developing the intellectual ideas. And then as that idea grows, my role turns from being in the driver's seat to being in the back seat, and ultimately to being just a spectator in the stands, watching other people, drive the thing. And I think that's a good thing, because if I was always just trying to hang on to being the sole independent contributor, then we wouldn't be 100 employees, it would be one still. And we would do 100th of the things we do. So that's why it's important. Okay, third thing is play and fun. So this applies for both of these bullets. How do we both innovate and scale in size? Play and fun are really important. So I'll tell you about the Italian crisis. I was on vacation in Rome. My wife and I, a few years ago, we land in Rome. Coming from North America, you usually get there like early in the morning or whatever. So our first full day, we're walking around side by side, sharing earbuds through like old Rome. We see the Colosseum and you see the Caesars. They built these huge, their egos were huge. They had to have the biggest thing. It's like Trump syndrome, the biggest thing, gold letters, biggest champion of the world, Caesar thing. That's kind of the same like startup muscle, right? That's like that fantasy of the startup entrepreneur in a sense of like, I'm going to make the biggest thing. We're going to make a corporation. We're going to make an idea. It's going to last forever. Then later that night, we went to dinner, small little restaurant, and the chef comes out. He talks to us, asks us what we'd like to eat, and he brings us also a masterpiece, not made from marble, but food, which is so transient, it lasts just a moment. This chef also reaching for mastery, reaching for glory, and something that is momentary and temporary. And these things were so at odds. And like I had a crisis. How should I live when I go back home? Like a Caesar in the fantasy and illusion of trying to make something forever? Or as the chef, making something just for the moment? So There's no clear answer. But it's a crisis, and these mysteries, they're meant to be experienced, not meant to be solved. So I try and bring play and creativity where I can into the lab. Did you know that you can open multiple YouTube videos at the same time and play different audio things of like the ping sonar of a submarine and a snoring track of somebody sleeping and snoring and like a fireplace, whatever you want. And we do a lot of fun things in the lab to have a good time so that you can stay fresh and creative and open-minded. So those things are all super, super important. I could talk to you guys for a long time about those things, but I think I'm going to wrap it up. And to me, the most important things on this journey of things to pack is really you have to be serious about becoming the expert in your field and being aware of the arc of a role, and also trying to have fun with all the things. So that's about it. I think I have one slide left here. And with my email, I thank you all for listening. Feel free to contact me, reach out if you have any questions. And thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Len. So if you want to email Len, you can email him at Zheleznyak, the usual spelling, at ClerioVision.com, or just contact us at StarFish and we'll connect you through. And that's amazing. Totally loved your talk, Len. Great insights for anybody who's a scientist contemplating moving into entrepreneurship, or a scientist struggling with your role in entrepreneurship, or an entrepreneur needs a scientist, or anything like that. I think that's really wonderful. The degree of sophistication of you guys is just incredible, that what it takes to play in this domain. So let's move on here. We're doing fine for time. And our next speaker is Brian King, who's on the line here. And as a bit of background, Brian is a principal Optic Systems Engineer at StarFish. He has a PhD in physics from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And he did his PhD work at US NIST. And over the last 25 years of working in the field, he's gained a lot of experience in ultrasensitive detection, optics, wavelength conversion, precision spectroscopy, and DUV semiconductor lithography, which I'm not even sure what that is. And he's been working at StarFish since 2018. So Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience of turning photons into medical products?
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. And it's really a pleasure and a privilege to hear these stories from these really compelling technical and business masters. It's really inspiring to hear about the way that we can take technology from the lab into a medical device that can actually change people's lives and make the lives of patients and doctors better. I feel like Len and Darren are these master authors, and they told us these great stories. Ironically, both you can think of in three parts. So maybe they're J.R.R. Tolkien, and each of them wrote their own version of Lord of the Rings. Me, I work with a large number of clients, and I do want to share some stories with you today that I hope will be helpful to you on your journey. But maybe you can think of me more as an anthology author. So I've got a few stories to share with you. To set it in context, all of you are listening today because you're interested in turning optics into a medical device. And as my friend and colleague Mark Derlick in our business development group has pointed out, to develop a class 2 510K cleared medical device takes a lot of money. And the development engineering costs are only about 10% of that total dollar amount to develop this device and turn it into a product in the market. But they're a really important 10% because the development and the engineering costs happen up front and underpin all of the other work. And so it's really important to get that stuff done right, in the right order, and do it efficiently. So how do you spend that device development and engineering cost to maximize your retained value in your company? There's a lot of different answers to that, and that's part of the reason why we have so many of these playbook events. But I wanted to share 4 anecdotes today. The first of them, to sort of pithily summarize it, is that a prototype is not a product, and that's okay. The second thing that I want to share with you is that at the beginning, when you first bring your system up and you're so excited because you're finally going to be able to show the whole thing working together, it can take a lot of work to get that whole thing working together. And don't forget, unlike in sort of traditional risk management where you worry about single or maybe double points of failure. When you first put the thing together, a lot of little things have to work together in concert before you get the exciting result that you want. When it comes to optical design teams, have a conversation with your optical designers and share your vision with them. Don't just give them a list of specifications. You'll be surprised at the wonderful things that come out of it. And finally, just a couple of anecdotes about optical suppliers, because I feel like the optics provision industry is kind of unique with a long and storied history, and it's got some quirks compared to other types of manufacturing and supply chain parts. So Darren showed you a picture of his laser system. I'm showing you here a somewhat less seasoned version of myself back in Boulder in the mid and late 90s, working on a system that used trapped ions held in an ultra-high vacuum and a very complex laser system to realize the first ever quantum logic gate. And this is sort of my element. I love taking complex optical systems and bending them to mighty whim, and then have the universe remind me that I'm just a human being and the universe is much smarter than me. So on the upper right here, we have an example of a very focused proof of concept optical coherence tomography device that I've recently assembled in the optics lab here in Victoria for StarFish. And this prototype, again, is pretty bare bones. It's meant to answer certain questions about longitudinal resolution and depth of scan. It doesn't even have a scan mirror because really the question I'm trying to answer is just about depth and resolution. But it's still made up of free space optics, and it doesn't look that different in kind from the work that I did as a graduate student. But when I'm doing this prototyping work, I like to remember our manufacturing technicians, who are the poor folks who will have to assemble the medical device after the design engineers have all their fun and design a robust product. And in all honesty, I'm not remembering just my colleagues here in StarFish. I'm also remembering Tom Scott. Now, Tom Scott was a manufacturing technician for a company that I worked for earlier. In fact, this DUV semiconductor lithography industry. And poor Tom had received the output of a design effort that was heroic and monumental and clever, a new type of optical spectral bandwidth metrology that answered customers' need in the semiconductor lithography business, and had taken really heroic efforts to get to work at all. And a lot of credit to the design team on getting this product to actually work. But unfortunately, so much of their attention had been put on this heroic effort of getting the technology to work that they hadn't thought about manufacturability. But poor Tom Scott was the person who actually had to build these modules and get them to work and do it in a timely manner so that we weren't burning up too much production time trying to make this thing work. So long story short, listening very much to Tom. Oh, well, this mirror is impossible to adjust. I don't even have the right software to help me calibrate this thing. By the way, this cable is so short that I have to improvise every time I assemble the module. We managed to take this design effort and turn it into something more manufacturable, satisfy our customers. But that's why when I'm thinking about a prototype, I'm also thinking about what the eventual device will look like. It's got to be manufacturable, both for the sanity of our very smart and talented manufacturing technicians, and also because cycle time costs money and reduces your profit margin. So an early prototype can be simple, focused, fast, and require a PhD optical scientist to adjust. Your production model needs to be different. It needs to be robust, intuitive, have minimal adjustments, and be sort of obvious to put together. And here I show an example of a camera lens. People have been making camera lenses for a very long time. They know their stuff. And you can see that each part in this camera lens sort of fits together logically, that the lenses are the right size for the part of the lens they fall into, and that it's relatively straightforward to drop these lenses in and put them in exactly the right location because of good optomechanical design and people who've thought a lot about how you actually assemble this on the production floor. So build a prototype, build a simple prototype, use 5-minute epoxy, require one of your design engineers to babysit it to get the answers that you need early. But don't forget Tom Scott. Along the same lines, there's nothing more exciting than putting your prototype together. Better yet, after you do your proof of concept prototypes, putting together your system for the first time, and finally this vision that you've had will be realized. it's exciting for you who are driving this vision. It's exciting for us who are doing the design work as well. This is our first chance to get real data and to see the impact of this thing. But don't be disappointed if that first system that you put together requires a lot of care and attention. It reminds me of some work I did very early in my career, but after I worked in Boulder, on something called Bose-Einstein condensation. It's a really interesting topic. I could talk about it for hours, but I won't. Basically, you take a whole bunch of atoms, you hold them in an ultra-high vacuum container with magnetic fields and lasers, and you put them all into one single macroscopic, almost millimeter big quantum wave function. But in order to do that, you need to make something called a MOT. And this picture is a picture of a magneto-optical trap, or MOT. In order for the MOT to work, you have to have 6 components of magnetic field aligned just perfectly with each other and with the laser beams. You have large laser beams that need to overlap perfectly, and the polarization needs to be perfect. My colleague and I, Steve Peel, built a magneto-optical trap and a whole Bose-Einstein system condensation up from a bare, empty lab. When we finally got everything together, we couldn't get it to work. We couldn't even catch atoms, which is the first step in making this Bose-Einstein condensation. Now, around us were a lot of very talented people who'd done a lot of work with these neutral atom traps, and everyone came in. We asked them what wisdom they had to share with us, and they all said, well, making a MOT is easy, and then walked out. But what we learned was that making a MOT is easy if someone else has done it before you, but it's really hard the first time. So we had to devise clever diagnostics to be able to isolate and reassure ourselves that each part of the system was working appropriately. And then what we found was each piece was working just a little bit off. And the multiplication of all those inefficiencies was what was preventing us from making a MOT. So we finally succeeded in dialing everything in. And what do you know? After that, making a MOT was easy. So when you're bringing a system up for the first time, don't assume it's going to work. And don't be dismayed if it's really tough to get it working. Be methodical and pay attention to what your key performance metrics and key performance controllers are. Make note of those and then design for them in the next round of the system. When you're designing your first build, make it as simple as possible and design a diagnostic for each adjustment. And when you're building this horribly complicated thing that you're so excited to see results from, don't forget Tom Scott. Now, third example I'd like to share with you is a client of ours who brought us a device that they had already developed and brought to successful clinical trials. And they were talking to us about sort of revamping the branding of the device and also bringing it into pilot production. When we had a look at the design of the optical system, it didn't quite add up to us. The idea of this phototherapy device is to deliver a pretty big uniform beam of the right intensity and irradiance to the patient location, the treatment zone. And it had like 10 pounds of optical mechanical infrastructure and a whole bunch of different lenses and a very complex beam designer. And it felt like there were 10 different types of beam homogenizers just to make sure that the beam was uniform. So myself and my colleague, Ryan Field, had a look at the design and came up with an alternate design that would be 1/3 of the cost in optics parts and about 1/3 of the cost in optomechanics as well, and probably about 1/100th of the weight. And so the challenge, though, is once you've got this cart moving, you got to keep it moving. And so you have to find a right time to sort of intersect these manufacturability improvements. Of course, the best way to make the device easily manufacturable and lower cost and more robust is design it in the first place. And I think what happened with this client is they hired some subcontractors to do their optical design work. And they may have delivered them specifications, and they may have delivered those specifications to a team that was used to thinking just about the drawing. When you're building your optical team, focus on requirements and system performance. Deliver them requirements, not a specification. Tell them what you want to do. Tell them why you want to do it, and empower them with understanding. In the worst case scenario, they do a really great job of delivering the requirements you asked for because they're going to drive you to developing that into specifications. In the best scenario, they come up with a clever way to solve the problem that you haven't thought about yet. Now, I've only got a few minutes left, but I thought I would share two stories that were interesting to me when I started dealing with optical suppliers. So the first is from my former employer, who had been building modules for years. When we tried to develop a new optical module that focused a spectrum onto a detector, the manufacturing technicians told us the focal point is just not right. It looks like the whole thing is out of focus. Well, we looked at the drawing first thing. Nope, the drawing was right. The focal point specified in the drawing was exactly what the design wanted. So we engaged the suppliers and we said, hey, your focal length is off. Can you please show us some documentation that you've measured it to be correct? And they looked at us as if we were speaking Greek, which none of us were, because they said, well, we don't have anything to measure focal length of the lens. Optic suppliers deliver radius of curvature. And we think what had happened over the years was that their optical materials had drifted a little bit in their properties. They still met the overall requirements for the supplier's good, high quality, inclusion-free optical materials, but the index had drifted a little bit, and that drifted the focal length. And nobody had noticed this until we listened to our manufacturing technicians who told us something funky was off. So we made a modification to the design to bring it back into spec. But I still remember the feeling of shock with my broader team when the suppliers looked at us as if we were speaking Greek when we asked them about the focal length that was clearly on the drawing. Optic suppliers focus on particular key specifications. And so when you're starting to go into production, have conversations about specs that you believe are key performance metrics and whether or not your optical supplier will be able to meet those specifications or even verify that they're true. One final little anecdote here. Something that's kind of interesting when you think about tolerancing, for many systems, after you do a design, you look at the variations between components and you might do a Monte Carlo analysis. And generally people assume that the distribution of built items will be normally distributed. But here's how you make a lens in the lower right-hand corner. You literally take a cylindrical hunk of glass and you go over it repeatedly with effectively sandpaper, finer and finer grit. And it's really optical slurry, but it's a very slow and laborious process. Now, optical suppliers usually polish more than one lens at a time, but it still takes days to polish these blanks into a lens. And so when you deliver a drawing to an optical component supplier, generally what they'll do is they'll grind the surface of that optic until it's just within your tolerance band, and then they're going to stop and go on and make the next component for the next customer. So when you're doing tolerancing analysis and simulation, don't expect your optical component properties to be normally distributed, because a lot of times they're not. It's also, I guess, the case, as Scott reminded me yesterday with lumber, if you can buy any these days for less than the price of a new car. So to sort of conclude this story, there's lots of important things in maximizing the impact of your early development, but some of the key learnings I've developed over the year: a prototype is not a product, and that's okay, as long as you remember that and don't mistake one for the other. When you put your system together for the first time, it's usually not one thing that's not working. It's a lot of little things, and you just have to be methodical and take notes so that as you move towards a production prototype, you start to control these things that were off in your first assembled model. When you're working with your optical system designers, start a conversation. Tell them about the context and give them what you need, not just a list of specifications, and you'll really get a good team dynamic and probably have some good solutions coming out of that. And finally, optics has been around for a very long time, as you know, and there are some kind of uniquenesses to the supply environment for optics. So be aware of those when you start to engage with optical suppliers, particularly as you start to scale up your production to larger batches. And with that, I'd like to turn this back over to Scott. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to Len and Darren. It's really been inspirational this morning.
Amazing. Well, I totally appreciated you guys. I know all of you are academics by background, and so you all have had a lot of experience speaking to other academics and presenting, your data in a certain style of statistical significance and so on. And being asked to give a talk that relates to entrepreneurship and a broader type audience, it's fantastic to see you guys adapt your styles to that. So it's It's lovely. So any of your audience members would like to open up the Q&A tab and write something that's on your mind there. Otherwise, I will just launch myself right in here, and I've got all sorts of things I want to ask these guys, and we have maybe 10 or 15 minutes to get through the Q&A here. So maybe I'll start in order. So maybe with Darren, I'm curious what I mean. There's so many things that are fascinating, but say as you've had to interact with the medical device industry, learn how to be a medical device engineer, learn how to interact with quality management systems, figure out how to do product definition. Can you tell us a little bit about how does a laser physicist figure all that stuff out?
Ooh, I don't know. I mean, Len mentioned, technical guy and business guy. I see these things entirely intertwined often. So it's more like, technopreneur versus the universe. Preferably you have experts. If I need regulatory advice, I'm going to go and ask someone like Scott. If I need, guidance on how to manufacture medical devices, well, I'll ask, someone like Scott and his team. So I think, the academic background, if anything, is detrimental to this process. You just kind of have to, balance intelligence and stupidity. Somehow as you go outside of your comfort zone and then begin to interact with other engineering disciplines.
Great. I'll maybe circle back on a similar theme, but balancing intelligence and stupidity, maybe that's a little bit like Len's magic of how do you become an expert. I'm curious, Len, you talked about watching Richard Feynman videos. What can you talk about anything you learned from watching the master?
Yeah, totally. He has this great one on when you speak to a large audience, there's always a variety of spectators. So there's different types of people in the audience. Some get really excited with artwork. Some get really excited with equations. Some get really excited with some other thing, historical stories. And he talks about trying to catch everybody so that you can bring everybody along for the ride. So he would do all the things, artwork, equations, stories. You do all the things. I really liked that. And that's one that stuck with me.
Brilliant. This is so much fun getting a chance to ask all these questions. So Brian, I'm curious, you talked a little bit about making an adjustment for each diagnostic, which to me ties into fixturing tactics, and like optics seems, any sort of optical assembly, it's a land of chasing your tail in my limited experience. You change one thing, it changes 9 other things, and you never know kind of, so you have to be very methodical about your sort of tactics around how do you actually get things on the right spots. And do you have any sort of practical experience to share with us on that?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I was chuckling as you asked the question, because back when I was in my research days, there's people who do things in the lab, experimentalists, and there's people who do things on paper, theorists. And our law was, if the theorist comes into the lab and they bump something, they have to tell you which mirror they bumped. But a lot of those mirrors that you saw on the table, even in Darren's lab, I suspect, are really just bouncing light from one place to another. And so I think one of the tricks is to really understand your optical design. A lot of the location of the optics don't really matter. And the location of some optics, your key focusing elements, are really, really important. So you got to pay attention mostly to where those are and understand the parts of the design that are not so super critical. And that way you don't end up making everything a 3-axis or a 6-axis, 6 degree of freedom adjustable mount. You just put in the adjustment that you need to get the optical performance into your requirements.
You make it as simple as you can. So when you tweak one thing, it only affects 5 things and not 9.
Keep it simple, StarFish. That's not how it goes, but I needed another S word.
Nice. So back to Darren then. I'm curious about the, your new company Point, and you're kind of unique in this setting in that you're the senior guy in a product company. So you have to actually decide where the resources of the company are going to get spent. And so how do you figure out what to do, and how did you figure out to do Point? And can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I guess this was an idea that started a very long time ago. And it required quite a bit of scientific effort in order to prove that it wasn't just a fantasy. So once that was accomplished, then it becomes my job to say, well, how do we push this technology, and how do we manage the the technical risk of not only attempting to commercialize another laser device, but one that includes a mass spectrometer. And so it's an ongoing process. I would lie if I said I felt like I knew what I was doing. I think in some sense, I liked what Len said about play and having fun. If we can get our mistakes out of the way early, we're not afraid of catastrophic failure, well, then we can really get some stuff done. But again, you just have to make this sober analysis of what's the likelihood of success if I go one way versus going another way. And so for me, it's always a question of building as much value as we can with as few resources as we have available. And then, with an ambitious goal in mind, then bridging that gap, well, that just takes an awful lot of effort and patience and maybe some luck.
So on a sort of related note, you showed your squiggly line chart with all the commercial applications. You made jokes about commercial applications a number of times, and then you showed, and here's the 20 that we're thinking about. It's how did, and you had your little 4 criteria, but it's more like a mixing board. How do you decide which criterion matters more?
I made that figure to scare away potential investors.
Brilliant.
No, it's a constant process of analysis. I mean, something that I learned from working with StarFish is that you can quantify anything, even if it's just a sentiment. And so trying to apply that to the various opportunities, looking for this ultimate fit where you have the technology, it fits, but you also have the market that justifies the development of the technology, and then you have the fashions and the trends that make this all possible. Getting all that to happen at the same time is rare. So you have to kind of move with a purpose.
And you're clearly going after a very, very large market now. That maybe we'll circle back to point at the end, and the sort of the cancer sniffer kind of idea. It sounds transformational. Like the world will not be the same after that. Let's say if cancer still exists, because the pharma industry hasn't killed it by then. But
that would be preferable.
So Len, I'm fascinated by your leadership journey. The fact that you spoke about it, and I loved your metaphor of driving the car and then being in the back seat of the car, and then being in the stands. But there's kind of an emotional pain to that. Like your whole value as a scientist is all about how smart you are, and how has that gone for you? And what is that?
It's been okay. Like there's positives and negatives. So the ego is such a dangerous thing, because it feels so good to be praised. So in the early days, I was first employee. I was the only technical guy. So I was the hero #1. I was the guy in the lab, getting all the praise. It was awesome. I was the wizard. And it feels good. But like, project gets so big, you need more wizards. Like, you can't be the only one. And but I genuinely want that. I want to hire people smarter than me. I want that so that the whole thing can grow better. So on the positive thing is like having a genuine desire to share that, to have multiple wizards, masters. You get less glory though. There's just less to go around, and that's okay. And you know what? Like, suck it up and deal. Like, grow up. Like, I don't know what to say to myself other than that. Like, it's an ego thing, and that ego thing is dangerous and shouldn't be listened to. I think. I don't know. What do you think?
Okay, well, they're part of that, and I've gone through a similar journey. Probably every leader in a technology company has had a similar thing where there's a sense of loss. Like if you stop focusing on the muscle you've been building, then you'll have less muscle. Then you'll have a different kind of muscle instead. So you can't kind of go back, right? So it's and yet you're more powerful for being broader. So you have any thought about that? So that's great. Well, thank you so much. It's not often that you get scientists talking about their emotional loss of technical expertise and what that means to them.
Just one thing on this topic. There's a philosophy professor in UCSF, Jacob Needleman.
Mhm.
Jacob Needleman. Check him out. He talks about, he says, in one quote I'll share with you guys, problems, they're meant to be solved. Problems are meant to be solved. What's the focal length of a lens? You can solve it, test it, measure it. Meant to be solved. It's a problem. But mysteries, like how do you transition from becoming a contributor to a manager? Mysteries are not meant to be solved. They're meant to be experienced. So I don't expect us to solve this question of how do we deal with that transition from the driver's seat to the stands. We are aware of it, we experience it, we feel it, and make some aims, have some intent, and keep going, keep climbing.
Fantastic. It's often in our leadership practice at StarFish talk about polarities, which are sort of unsolvable. You can't even really call them problems. They're things that there's situations to be managed. Like how do you sort of the complexity versus comprehensiveness? Like how you can't really you just have to figure out in any given situation where you want to land on that, right? Okay, let's move on to Brian, and then I'll have one round of follow-ups for all you guys. So Brian, you talked about the sort of requirements and having discussions. And to me, that's an art form, the art of requirements at the right level of abstraction. And because people inevitably approach us with a very instructive, just do this, do that, the other thing. And it's kind of our art to help broaden the question to the right level. I wonder if you have any wisdom to share with us on that art of requirements gathering.
Well, I think, if you're the person coming, trying to design a medical device and engaging a team, you need to think about what your device needs to do and how it needs to be used, and maybe let go a little bit to speak to what Len and a little bit Darren have talked about how. And so try to specify the what and not the how, because that enables a bigger, broader, and more diverse design effort. And that results in a specification, oh, this will perform exactly this way eventually. But that's one thing. And on the flip side of that, I think there are two things that are important for people who are receiving requirements or engaging on the sort of the being engaged on that conversation. And that's, first of all, ask why. There's a great thing from trying to find root cause in manufacturing issues, the 5 whys is not just from that, right? Ask why again, ask why again, keep digging, and you will collaboratively with the person you're designing with come to the real nugget of the problem. And the other thing that I think is really important, I'm a poor example of it right now, but we all love to talk. We want to solve problems. It's so important to listen mindfully. Oftentimes somebody's saying we need a focal length of exactly this, that, and otherwise it's just like so difficult to align this thing. Wait a minute. Why is it difficult to align this thing? That's the important question. Not so much whether the focal length is 1.0256 meters or 1.0257. So I guess those would be some thoughts from me on that.
Great, thank you. That's lovely. So maybe we'll go in reverse order, and I'll ask the question as an optics PhD. Butting into the medical device industry, what words of wisdom would you share with anybody else who's an academic trying to figure out their way in the medical device industry?
In a similar context, I used to remind people who worked with me and for me in many situations, a technology is not a product, right? We're not in the business of making some device that does A, B, or C. We're in the business of selling and deploying it. Right? And so you got to think about the end product and the user experience and how it makes physicians' lives better and patient lives better. And just be sort of mindful to that whole process and not just your little part of it. And then be aware that the regulatory environment for medical devices is complex. And you don't have to be an expert in it. That's probably not why you're in your role in your company, but find people who do have some perspective and listen to their perspectives.
Great, thank you, Brian. Okay, Len.
I'm one for finding experts. So we got lucky in that there are huge corporations with a lot of disgruntled employees, people that don't like working at these huge organizations that have been doing this thing for decades. So we get to like get a bunch of them. Like, for example, like in refractive surgery, there's a thing called a patient interface, the thing that docks onto an eyeball. I don't know how to design that, but there is somebody that does, so let's hire them. I like adding people onto the team that are experts in a thing, have done it before. For a medical device, I think it's important. Like, yeah, there's some things, like, in other words, the really hard problems that we have to solve, let's focus our energy on solving problems that no one has solved before. If somebody's already solved a thing, like, that's a waste of my time. Like, we can buy our way, hire our way out of that. We're here to solve the problems that nobody has solved before. Because if we don't, no one else will. So that's a better use of our time. So find an expert, I think. That's
awesome. Great. Darren, closing comment from you.
What would I tell an academic in optics who reveals to me in a confession that they're thinking about going into medical devices? That's the question, right?
Yes.
So I don't know. I would have a lot of conflicting things. I would probably tell them the same thing I tell everyone, which is that, you know, now is the time to figure out what it is you enjoy out of life and to pursue that, and not to get distracted by what you thought you enjoyed. And so to, you know, not believe your own nonsense, I think is the key, because medical devices are really hard. Like I said in my talk, you know, this is hardware. And this is hardware with a regulatory burden on it. And it absolutely has to work. In industry, in material processing, you can get away with all sorts of things, because ultimately, you know, your customer just needs a solution, you know, and they're not thinking globally like you need to when you're dealing with a medical procedure, or when you're dealing with many doctors around the world who might be the first adopters of your novel laser technology in the thousands or tens of thousands. So it's you have to be really patient, I think, in this particular business, because it doesn't move quickly, and you don't get those quick, you know, successes that you do when you're an academic, when you're the technical hero. You know, ultimately, the business is successful or the business isn't successful. And so the heroes, you know, it's all an illusion until you get to the finish line. So that's what I would attempt to convey, is that, you know, you sort of need infinite patience if you want to do something interesting and meaningful.
Brilliant. Well, I never imagined this would be so philosophically profound, to get 3 optics PhDs together to talk about their work. It's been amazing, and totally appreciated the presentations here today. Thank you deeply to all of you 3 guys for spending your time thinking about how to fit this format. Anybody who's watching, you can go to the StarFish Medical website /webinars. In a few days, and you'll see this talk up there, and all the contact information, etc., will be up there as well. Only in the video. We don't want to expose them to too much spamming. And feel free to contact us at StarFish if you can't figure out how to contact one of the people and you have a question for them. Hope you really enjoyed the show. It's been totally fun to deliver it, and do come back. And we will also be adding some entrepreneur interviews into the mix here as well, just to round out our offering. Just like Len said, you need a little bit of something for everybody. So thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks all.